everybody, I'm Amy, this is my wife Maggie, and together we are ThinkerThemer, and we're excited to be reviewing for you today Windmill Valley, the new title by Danny Garcia and Board and Dice. Now, why does this copy have a little sticker in the corner? This is the Board Game Barbecue podcast, who recently hosted their first inaugural PlayCon in Sydney, and kindly let us borrow this from their library in order to play it more and make this review for them. So if you haven't checked out their podcast, do so, and we hope to see you at PlayCon in 2025. But now let's get into it.
So in Windmill Valley, we find ourselves in the late 19th century in the Netherlands, where we're going to be collecting and planting beautiful tulips onto our farm to make this beautiful flower bed. We're also going to be enhancing our farm and our windmill and creating a whole network of windmills. At the end of the game, whoever's created the best farm will be the winner.
In this game, your player actions revolve around this revolving cog system in your windmill. And what's interesting about this game is at the start of your turn, you're going to decide what water flow the floodgate has. And you get to decide whether that's going to be 1, 2, or 3. And then you're going to adjust this cog. You're going to turn it clockwise, either 1, 2, or 3 steps. And then wherever this lands, you're going to be able to decide between the two actions that these arrows are pointing to. Now, there's a range of actions that you can take in this game, but the main thing you're trying to build out is the puzzle that's on your player board, which relates to your tulip garden. And ideally, you're trying to make rows of tulips of the same color and then columns of tulips of different colors in order to optimize this puzzle and make the most victory points at the end of the game. Now, the namesake of the game are windmills, and Windmill Valley is where you're going to be putting out your network of windmills that you will remove from your player board. And the reason why you want to remove them from your player board is because they're going to unlock multiplier effects for the tulips that you have planted at the end of the game. But also, when you do place a windmill out into Windmill Valley, you are going to get to take the actions that are adjacent to the place where you've placed the windmill. When placing a windmill, you really need to start close to the market, but as other people or your opponents build out windmills, you're going to be able to create chained effects to get further out to the more powerful actions on the board. Now, at the center of the board is the market action, and the market action allows you to move your player token around this little rondelle, love a rondelle, and you get to take tulips of different colors to put them in your storage, or you get to plant them into your puzzle where ultimately you need them to be in order for them to score. However, instead of putting your tulips into your garden, you can also ship them to foreign nations and score or take actions according to the shipping card that is in play at that moment. But this game is really interesting because it can end really quickly. The pace is set by the players because the game will end when someone has taken 4 revolutions of their big cog. So if you speed through the actions, you are going to trigger the end game quicker. But what's interesting is because of that fact, you really need to get your engine up and running as fast as you can. And the 2 ways to get your engine up and running are to draft new segments that take the place of the actions on your cogs, which is really fun because they slot into either one of the cogs. And you can also draft these cards, which are going to be placed either at the top of your board to give you an ongoing benefit or extra action every time you trigger another action, creating a chain effect, or you can place them at the bottom of your board as a contract, which is going to give you end game bonus points. There are a few other things going on in this game that are worthwhile mentioning before we talk about how we felt about it. But the first is with the water flow, which isn't always in your favor. And so there are these tools that you can collect and spend in order to add or subtract 1 movement point from your cog. The other thing is that there's a public objective, just 1 per game, that usually has something to do with the pattern that you're creating in your garden. That can help dictate your strategy, as well as a starting ability that is asymmetric across the players, which could also help dictate the strategy that you want to take for the game. So now let's talk about how we felt about the game. And wow, this game is really fun from the first game. Like, that's what I'll say about this game. It's super accessible. And everyone that we've taught it to has just straight away felt like this was a good time.
It was very easy. It's easy to teach because it's actually fairly straightforward to kind of wrap your head around, like, oh, what are the key things that you're doing? This cogwheel mechanism is super engaging, and also because it's so colorful, inevitably, like when we've been playing it at, like we're playing it at the con, at the PlayCon, and people are like, what is that? What is it like? How does this work? So this is also quite satisfying as you're kind of making the turns. And the iconography is very, very easy to understand and follow as well.
This has actually had some of the best iconography in a game that I've played in a long time. It's easy to first understand what they each stand for, and then it really helps new players get into it. I think the cog element is not necessarily new, like we've seen cogs before, but I think that this windmill is really interesting because it just gives you a choice of A or B, at least at the beginning of the game. And when you're teaching a new player, that makes immediate sense. And that's why it's really easy to get into. But then as you start to understand more, of course, more layers come into the strategy of the game, which brings us to our next point, which is really at the heart of this game is engine building. And it's a fantastic engine builder, especially at the more accessible end of the spectrum, because there are really two engines going on here that go hand in hand. One is of course, you start with some kind of ability at the beginning. For example, for me here, every time I build a windmill out into the map, I'm going to get a victory point and a coin, and coins are really hard to come by in this game. That is one of the, the tightness of trying to decide what you're going to do is really you have to trying to avoid taking this distress action.
So, and that's the other thing, is like sometimes it's like this distress action, which is all to do with the water level. As you're raising or decreasing the floodgates, it's going to be impacting automatically the water level. And so the higher the water level, the more incentivized you are to help bring it down, because every time you bring it down, you're going to be getting some nice rewards for it.
But I digress from the
sorry, I digressed.
Building. No, I did. I did. No, stop. So when you put these cards down, it's really cool because these cards are multi-purpose cards. Now, the top half of these cards represent something that you can place at the top, which is going to give you an ongoing benefit. And this is where you can chain some really cool actions together. For example, here, this is saying that anytime I take one of these cards, I'm also going to get to do a planting action, moving my tulips from my storage area to my garden. So that is a fantastic ongoing chaining ability. And so I would place that at the top of my board like this. Or if I wanted to, I could use it for its contract ability and place it down the bottom, which is going to give me another goal to kind of aim towards at the end of the game. But that's just one part of the engine building. So here I can create some chain actions. And just while we're on the topic, I love that this board is double layered, but on the back, it has obviously the currency that you're tracking here, but it has dual laying on the back so that you can slide cards in easier. So nice. But the other part of the engine building is in the windmill itself. And there are 3 levels of benefits that you can take. The more powerful ones you have to pay for. And then you can cover up any segment in either of the cogs. And what's interesting is these cogs have different numbers. This took me a couple of games to work out that the right cog only has 5 spots, the left cog has 6. So they'll never completely be aligned. Every time you rotate this, they're going to align differently with each other. But the really cool thing in this game is when you get some of the more expensive segments, they have this little plus symbol. And that means now instead of choosing one or the other, you get to take both actions. And so that is going to really power up your game and is something that, you really need to get going in the early parts of the game in order to be benefiting from that.
I find that even though you're now getting to take, and that's really interesting because often you have that whole, they're both good, both actions are good, but I only have to commit to one or the other. And that happens a lot. There's that at that level. There's also here when you kind of collect this, these sort of enhancements going, they're both good. Do I commit it at the bottom or do I commit it at the top? And another interesting decision space is as you're putting the windmills out, you always have to have a path back to the market, unless you have a tile ability that allows you to break that, but that's a separate thing. So usually you have to have this sort of path connecting you back to the market, which means the earlier turns are going to start all around adjacent to the market, which are kind of less powerful benefits that you're getting. So when you're going to the further ones, out, you're having to make this choice because often you're kind of connecting through opponent windmills, which when you do that, you're going to give them points.
Yes.
So you're sort of deciding, okay, do I take the more expensive positions, give potentially some points to my opponents, but all of a sudden get the much more powerful benefits, which sometimes are getting to take additional actions or actions at a discounted rate or multiple versions of those actions.
And even though you're giving opponents points potentially by putting windmills out, you really, really want to do it because the more of these windmills you take out from your player board, the more they're going to multiply the tulips that you have in your garden. And what's really interesting is, like, for example, the dark blue tulips, they're going to give you 3 victory points per planted tulip that you have at the end of the game if you can remove the windmills, but that one takes 3 windmills that you need to remove before you can unlock that scoring ability.
For
whereas,
that color,
whereas for white, it's just 1 victory point and 1 windmill that you need to remove. So I like the way that makes you think about, I'm probably not going to get all of the windmills out in one game because remember, you're only turning this wheel 4 times. So you have to think really carefully about that.
And speaking of the calendar and the revolution, so there's this whole thing of every time you manage to do a full turn and go back to the original spot, which is marked with this full red line, that's when you're going to be able to move your token to the next stage in the calendar area at the top. That's quite handy because obviously you're going to be getting the bonus at the top, but then you also get first dibs on which of the bottom benefits you're going to get. And obviously you're going to pick the most valuable. But sometimes there's actually interesting decisions. Like, you know, for the third round, you have the choice between an action, a planting action, or money, which can be quite tight and you might really kind of need as well.
And so that calendar system can really dictate how quickly you want to move through because you might be looking at another player thinking they're just about to trigger that and they might take that planting action that is key to my strategy. I need to do that planting action. So do I speed through and catch up essentially with my cog so that I can be the first one to go there and get that benefit? So it really is interesting thinking about the pacing of the game. You could potentially rush through the game, particularly if you saw that someone had a strategy, maybe it was to do with the planting of the tulips that was going to take them a bit longer to get going. Maybe you've got some really great points in the early game, so you want to speed through the end and trigger the end game. But that didn't really happen in any of the games that we've played because it's really not the spirit of the game. And because each of the steps on your cog present you with an interesting choice for an action, more often than not, even though I'm someone that loves to speed through a game, more often than not, I was like, do I really want to skip that action?
Yeah, forego those actions.
Forego
knowing
that action.
That then, you're probably not going to see those again, and there might be another way of getting it, but it's like, and now the end of the game is closer.
And so actually what I've found in this game is because you start to learn how to leverage each of the actions to chain other actions, as we've played this game, it's been quite interesting. Our early games were much faster than our later games because in our later games, we were like, well, now I've set myself up to be able to use that action more effectively or to chain a whole heap of things together. So that's been really interesting, but ultimately, this game has really snappy actions.
Yeah, the actual turns themselves tend to be pretty snappy. It's you do get to points where someone may chain quite a lot of things together, and so they might take a little bit longer, but that's more the exception than the rule.
Yeah, and overall, this game, the turns are just so fast. It comes back around to you really quickly, which is really nice because, you know, a puzzle like this that's on your player board could become very multiplayer solitaire, but it doesn't even feel like that because most of the time you're just thinking about what action am I going to take next, and then all of a sudden it's your turn again, which means that the time on the box is actually really accurate from a game length time. So it says 45 minutes to 90 minutes and definitely at a 4-player, 3-player count, it's around the 90-minute mark. 2 players, Maggie and I can play a game of this in 45 minutes. And the scaling is
that's actually playing at the slowest, like going, we're only going to be turning one at a time because we want to make the absolute most out of every single turn.
And the scaling for 2 players is actually really, really good. You don't have to do that much to change anything. You just block out some of these bonus spots in the calendar and you add in more neutral tokens in the market area. But for the most part, it feels like the same game. You probably won't get to the outer parts of the Windmill Valley.
Yeah, the networks are not as strong because there's not as many people placing windmills.
But because there is an action that can mitigate that, if you have that right, segment in your windmill. You're going to be able to place further out anyway without having that network, so that helps with that. And the only thing I would say is quite different at a lower player count is the shipping action. The shipping action, which we haven't talked about, is where you get to place a different colored tulip onto this card, and then depending on where you place it, you get to take the actions or bonuses that are in the quadrants adjacent to that tulip. Or instead of shipping out your tulip, you can actually take all of the tulips that are on that card and bring them back into your storage. So you can exchange it in two different ways, but when there's fewer players using this shipping ability, it doesn't change over as often. It doesn't fill up as often. So that's really one of the main differences at a lower player count.
Yeah. I also like that even at the lower player counts, you always have the option with the markets to just pay a coin to refresh it. That actually has been really, really handy, because that's often one of the downsides of like the lower player counts, like, oh, you're not really getting to see as many things and you kind of get stuck. Not with this.
And if you're really clever, you could also refresh the market before you choose just to flush a scoring condition that might work for another player. So you can use it to your advantage in that way, but most of the time you are just paying attention to what you're trying to do and optimize your action. So it never feels like a mean game in any sense. It feels how it looks. Like an easy breezy Windmill Valley, delightful color puzzle. It's just
but still quite satisfying, and like the crunchiness of the choices that you're getting to make.
Yes, and you've played it solo.
Yeah, so the way that the solo implementation works is fairly straightforward in that you just have this deck of cards, and you're going to set up obviously the gardener as like their board is a simplified kind of board, because they won't get any bonuses as they're placing their tulips. But then you're just going to be flipping this, and it's going to be telling you essentially their turn order is similar to yours. Are they going to be increasing, opening or shutting the floodgate, which will then obviously affect this, and then whether the water level, and then whether or not they're going to take advantage of that water level action. Then depending on that, it'll obviously move their wheel. So they will still have their windmill cogs there, and then they'll be taking the particular action there. And all of their actions are essentially, again, like a simplified version, which by having these cards displayed, it just shows you their preferred color tulip for that action. If they were to take this, the foreign trade action, where they would place it. If they're collecting these cards or any of those upgrades, which ones are the ones that they're going to be removing. So fairly straightforward. And then they're going to be getting points for all the different things that they're collecting. So then you can also make it vary the difficulty, which will essentially just vary how many points they're going to collect or gain for each one of those things that they're collecting. And so I found it, even though it's a fairly straightforward implementation, I did find it as someone that doesn't really enjoy the Automa experience, because even though it's a fairly straightforward game, there's still quite a lot of things that you're trying to sequence. So I found that it was just enough of facilitation that then by the time I came back to my turn, I was a little bit lost. So again, there's not too many things to do, but there's enough that you're like, oh, what is it that happens with that again? Oh, I need to put it here. And then, and so I wouldn't be playing this solo myself, because I prefer Automas to just completely kind of stay out of the way, and you don't really have to do that much. Having said that, if you're the type of person that is quite comfortable with like that sort of Automa, also if you're wanting to have the experience of beating an opponent, then this is going to be the type of Automa for you.
Yeah, and I have to say that once Maggie came back to playing multiplayer after playing solo, she definitely did much better and managed to beat us, which I always think is like Maggie's training is the solo mode.
Sometimes that is the case. Like I feel like that definitely happened with Woodcraft. Like when we played Woodcraft, I was like, as I played with the solo, I was like, oh, you learn more about the game. Whereas I feel like with this one, it just allowed me to experience more different different avenues.
I think you came back stronger.
But I didn't learn. It wasn't a like sometimes the Automa teaches you what are the optimal ways. In this case, it wasn't that. It was more just like I got to have more experience playing the game, and so play more things.
But ultimately, this game will stay in our collection. Of course, not our
not
the copy that we've borrowed.
This one has to go back to the library.
We went to Board Game barbecue are like, can we please have our copy? No, we said we're keeping it. But this definitely deserves a spot in our collection. It is a great, accessible Euro mid-weight game. It's such a delight to teach. It doesn't take very long to teach at all. And then as soon as people start playing, because the iconography is so strong, because there's interesting choices, even if you're not optimizing everything at once, it's like, I don't know, it's just a delight. It really
it's very
is
satisfying, and it's not tense. Like, it's actually a very relaxing sort of experience playing it.
And because it works great at all player counts, you know, solo if you don't mind facilitation, but then 2, 3, and 4 player counts, it means that it's going to hit the table more often. It doesn't, you know, matter if someone comes around and they're like, oh, I'm bringing a friend, and you're like, oh no, it doesn't work as well at 4 players. No, this is going to work. And so it's a really strong recommendation from us. Actually, for me, it's my favorite of Danny Garcia's titles already. Arborea was a great game that was probably let down by some of the choices visually, whereas this has much stronger iconography. For Barcelona, this game is much easier to get into, easier to learn and enjoy. So I really, really like this game. I'm going to give it quite a high rating. For me, I think it's an 8.3.
Ah, interesting. Well, for me, it's also an 8.3, but I would not put it above Arborea. Arborea, I think, and not because it's just because Arborea is crunchier for me. It sort of has that next level of complexity and kind of calculations and like, oh, what will happen here? And I actually I'm one of the apparently few people that actually really enjoy, even though it's a lot of color, I really enjoy that kind of saturation of color. Barcelona would actually be third for me at least as well.
And I like color too, but I also really value the accessibility of a game because I love to teach games to other people, and so that makes this higher in my estimation. But we hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now.
Bye.